Today we're talking T'au, with a tier list of every unit in the codex, which are strongest and which are weakest. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where the T'au Codex has been out for a good few weeks now. Plenty of people have been getting in games with it, and there's been a fair few successful tournament lists, which help shine a spotlight on which things in the T'au are really working well right now, and which things people are choosing to leave on the shelf. With that in mind, I've rated the units in the codex into 3 different tiers, starting with tier 3 the weakest, and moving forward to tier 1 the strongest. I will go through each of the units in turn, and why I've chosen to rate it where I have. I'm going to be largely focusing on the T'au Codex unit, though I will touch on a couple of Forge World things that are relevant. Plenty to go through here then, so let's jump straight into it. First up, we'll start with tier 3, units that I generally think are a bit overcosted compared with other ones within the codex, and I suspect aren't really going to see all that much play in the top lists until things change. They still seem usable, but just less good than taking something different. First up, we have the Sniper Drones and the Firesight Marksman. They now have to be taken as one combined slot. Basically, when you shake out the numbers, I just think that they add up to a really not particularly efficient sniper unit, and the Marksman doesn't even have the slightly dubious duty of being a character protective marker light source anymore, as you need to take his drones with him. In general, in 9th edition, sniper units just typically struggle a bit with terrain and bodyguards, and I just can't really see too many people choosing to run these guys, not compared with what you could get for the same amount of points. It's perhaps a fairly similar story with Piranhas. The only real good thing that they have going for them, I think, is their mobility. Their burst cannon might be a little bit stronger in strength, but really doesn't do much, and now the gun drones cost a command point to disembark, it's just not quite as good a producer of chaff. I guess maybe it could be used in a similar sort of way to the Space Marine Landspeeder Storm, just zipping around and being very mobile and being an expendable unit to throw onto objectives. Maybe somewhat okay as a utility unit, though I still think it's a bit overshadowed. Next we have the Tidewall fortifications. Despite being fortifications, they essentially function a bit like transports that you can fire out of with fire warriors. Their durability is maybe alright for the points with an invul save, but it's perhaps just a little bit depressing that they move really slowly, and I think you're basically always going to be better off with Devilfish zipping fire warriors into the middle of the field. They just seem to do the whole fire warrior transport support thing much better than these. Finally, for T'au Codex units in tier 3, I think that compared with the other gunline units, the Razor Shark and the Sun Shark just don't really have all that much damage output. Flyers do need to be really quite efficient with damage if they're going to overcome the fact that they have basically no impact on objectives, and I don't really think that this pair are really quite there. They've both got interesting features, the Sun Shark with the disembarking interceptor drones for 1 CP, and the Razor Shark with its quad ion turret, which does put out a little bit of anti-medium infantry fire. But I think in general they're going to be overshadowed by basically every other gunline unit in the whole codex. I think the premium that they pay for their mobility is just a bit too much really. They're not even really particularly tough either, with only a 4+ save. Finally, and I know I said I wouldn't touch on Forge World too much in this review, but I think in general the T'au Forge World options really needed quite a big boost to be in line with this new codex. The vast majority of Forge World choices weren't really played in the last decks at all, perhaps with a few exceptions such as Remora stealth drones and maybe occasional Tetras. In general, I think while the new book has certainly helped out some of the Forge World choices with some army-wide special rules, the fact that it's also buffed all the codex datasheets so much just generally means the vast majority of Forge World choices are kind of overshadowed now. For example, I don't think I'd want to take a Taunar Supremacy armor if you could get basically 3 Storm Surges for the same cost. The flyers aren't enormously stand out, and the hazard suits I believe still lack core. When looking at tournament lists that people are playing with, it does seem that people are using Tetras a bit more, but I thought we'd focus on them in tier 2 where I've ranked them. Speaking of which, let's talk about the tier 2 T'au units. These are all units that I describe as pretty reasonable picks, but maybe lack the absolute all-out efficiency of the top tier, or maybe units that you want to use in a bit more of a niche fashion and not something that you want to make your entire battle line out of. First up, I've chosen to rank the new Darkstrider here. He was one I perhaps could have been persuaded to put up in tier 1. I think he is pretty strong for what he does for the cost. He gives out +1 to wounds to 1 key shooting unit, which could be all he really needs to do to be honest, and also hands out some fallback and shoot buffs to non-battlesuit infantry, and a couple of other helpful things including a bit of shooting. Perhaps his main disadvantages are being locked to only the T'au Sept, though I do admit that they're certainly one of the best ones, but he is also competing with other very good HQs, particularly Ethereals and Commanders, both of which I think are generally going to take precedent over Darkstrider. Still though, certainly a very solid unit. I can still see him appearing in a lot of strong lists. Next up we have the Ghost Kill. I feel that this guy does pay a bit of a premium for his forward deployment rule and the stealth drones that make him not able to be shot from greater than 18 inches away. I do quite like that even when you've closed the distance, you could potentially make him even tougher still with that 5+ feel no pain, and it just seems that he could be quite an interesting choice for holding down a far-flung objective. I think the not being shot from far away thing really is quite handy, but you do pay a bit of a premium for it on the ghost kill. Its damage output just isn't quite as good as quite a lot of the other battle line units. It can certainly chip in, but it's not going to win the fight by itself. Still though, I don't think it's useless, just maybe not something that you want to spam 3 of. Next we have Ornshi, the melee duelist ethereal from Viola. Just like Ornvar, he gets multiple reliable invocations, casting 2 of them on 2+, which to be fair, like the other ethereals, does make him pretty good. I think his main issue is that he's probably just going to be the last ethereal out of the 3 that you'd want to take. If you are playing Viola, all well and good. His unique buff is kind of handy for a bit of extra overwatch, but I think if you're not, probably either Ornvar or the regular one are more tempting. Either you save a few points and potentially can get a bit more mobility with a hover drone, or you have Ornvar, who's just really hard to kill for the points with his 2 honor guards. Still though, certainly not bad, and he can do a little bit of fun melee as well. Next up we do have the Tetris, basically zippy floating marker-like platforms. Their movement is really good at 18 inches, so could potentially be a good choice for getting marker lights on things that you're about to hit with a whole lot of smart missile systems or air-bursting fragmentation projectors. There's not really a lot more to what they do, to be honest, but I think they do it quite well. Again, kind of like the Piranha, I think they could be used quite well as sacrificial units, maybe ones that you can expend just when you need to jump on an objective and put an annoying model to remove from it, or seeing as they're vehicles, they could be quite handy for scoring things like engage on all fronts. An 18-inch moving vehicle with fly for only 40 points is pretty nice. Next up we have Hammerheads and Skyrays. The Hammerhead Railgun might certainly be one of the bogeymen of the new T'au Codex, but despite its fairly ridiculous stats, for the points it is kind of in line with a lot of the other heavy support choices and gunline units, and perhaps you do pay a bit of a premium for the massive boost of ignoring invuls. In terms of actual damage output for the points, the 2 are actually kind of similar. The Skyray is a bit cheaper but still hits fairly hard with those missile racks, and it does bring a couple of marker lights to the party as well, which do help make up the difference. In general, it seems that some people have been choosing to run Hammerheads, but the majority seem to have not been spamming them. It seems that Mr. Hammerhead Commander Longstrike himself does seem to be the favoured choice when they're played. Moving on, we have the Kroot Shaper. I feel like actually what he can do for 25 points really is quite impressive. He's a bit of a general all-rounder type character who is usually going to punch above his weight, but he's just perhaps not a very necessary character in the army, to be honest. Often Kroot are just quite happy doing exactly what they do, not investing extra things in supporting them. Still though, for 25 points it's really not investing all that much into one. He can buff Kroot, he can put out a fairly decent amount of damage with his grenade belt, has a small amount of melee, and also gets the pre-game move as well. I guess he could be a bit of a liability if you're playing a lot of characters and your opponent takes Assassinate, but in general I think if you even are just taking 1 or 2 Kroots along, I don't really think that a Shaper's a bad choice. I think you'll get more value than 25 points out of him in quite a few games. Next up we have the Pathfinders. Per model they do seem like really quite an efficient unit, both putting out a decent amount of marker light support, a bit of pulse carbine fire, and potentially some quite serious anti-armor threat if you upgrade them with a bunch of rail rifles or something. I think that Pathfinders would perhaps be a lot more tempting though if you weren't locked into taking big squads of 10 of them. It just seems like a bit of an awkward number to take for a unit that's really quite fragile, and might well just die the first time they're exposed, even if there are quite a lot of them. I guess you can potentially move 5 marker lights then move again with them, but you would have to hand over some command points to do that. I think that between their marker lights and their damage output though, they do seem really quite interesting, but just still really quite annoyingly expensive for their defensive profile. Moving on, we have the Kaida Fireblade. Again, like Darkstrider, a cheap little HQ choice. If you are running multiple units of Fire Warriors and actually want to be using them to deal direct damage, it's really not bad. It's just a bit of a shame that he has a little bit less synergy if he's jumping out of a Devilfish from them, as he's not able to use his command phase bonus from within a transport. Again, if you just want to add a little bit more firepower to your Fire Warriors, it's really not too bad for the cost. Again though, his main problem might be facing good competition from the other great HQs, Commanders and Ethereals in particular. Next up we have the hero of the Enclaves, Commander Farsight himself. Of course Sep's locked, so he isn't going to be useful if you aren't running Farsight Enclaves, but if you are then I think it's kind of reasonable. He has the generic Crisis Commander buffs, things like being able to ignore modifiers and also fall back and shoot, and he gets a couple of plasma rifle shots and of course his very decent melee profile with the Dawn Blade. I think he's an okay choice and certainly really quite cool as a melee Tau. In general though, I don't think it's going to be quite as efficient as the other commanders, the ones where you get to choose exactly which weapons you want on them, and then potentially load them up with a warlord trait, relic, and a prototype system as well, which, as we've discussed on the channel, can be used to make a brutal town melee commander, that between that onager gauntlet, thermoneutronic projector, and precision of the hunter can be far more fighty than Farsight even, and pack a whole load more firepower as well. Still though, certainly not a bad pick, and doesn't require the same amount of investment in terms of command point upgrades. Next up we have the tactical drones, who have maybe fallen on hard times somewhat since the previous edition of the book. Seeing as savvy protocols is just one drone at a time now, they don't really have the same sort of value as a shield swarm, and perhaps the best go-to use for them might be using small squads of marker drones, nice expendable units that you can move around quickly and throw down a bunch of marker lights. It doesn't really matter too much if they die, and if you can keep them hovering around your important units, then you might be able to tank some serious damage with savvy protocols. Could be good for units that don't get attached drones. In general though, if you do have the slots available, it might be a bit easier to attach drones to characters. That way you get sources of marker lights that you can't typically directly shoot. If you need just a few more though, then a tiny squad of 40 points worth of these doesn't seem bad at all. Next up we have the Riptide. Again, perhaps a suit that used to be the mainstay of the army, now I think is definitely in second place in firepower terms. It definitely has some fun advantages, but I'm not really sure that those advantages really outweigh the pure stats that you get from things like the core broadsides or from storm surges. You can get 6 shots out of a strength 8, damage 4 ion accelerator now, but that will set you back a big 250 points, and it doesn't have anywhere near as many secondary weapon shots compared with those broadsides or the storm surge. Still though, it does remain kind of reasonable damage output for the points, and the biggest draw to the unit certainly is that Nova reactor, giving you 3 really powerful options, either a bit of move shoot moving, a 5+ feel no pain, or even more shots on your main gun. All good stuff, but I'm not sure it's quite enough to catch up. Maybe could have particular place in the Balkan army. It is quite a good option for using that 2CP ignores invuls strat on. Finally for tier 2 we come to the Krutox Rider. I'd certainly say is one of the lower ones out of this particular list. I feel like in general not that many people are going to take them competitively, but in terms of points for what he does, I still don't think he's terrible. 25 points for a nuisance unit that you could park on an objective, and it does have a bit of range and melee threat as well. A mobile autocannon's worth of firepower, backed up by 4 strength 6, AP-2, damage 2 melee attacks. I do feel that perhaps a unit of 3 of these could be really quite an annoying unit for the opponent to have to deal with. Lumber them up behind some cover, then maybe pop up onto an objective, try and assault whatever's there. Then they're going to be an annoying toughness 5 unit to deal with 12 wounds. That's really quite low on the priority threat list for the opponent. Not too bad on a unit that gets to move before the game begins as well. Though I do think that the cavalry keyword is a bit of a weakness. It means that they don't interact with terrain very well. Moving on though, let's get into the big guns of the T'au Empire. These are the units that I think are going to make up the majority of tournament lists, and from the list that I've looked at do seem to be getting quite a bit of play already. First up, certainly some of the rock stars of the T'au Codex are the Crisis battlesuits and their bodyguard equivalents. I think Games Workshop's done well to turn them from a fairly underwhelming unit into a really threatening core unit with some enormous firepower, and also some very decent movement tricks and good support options too. Being a core unit that you can take a big unit of, they're great with just about any buff that you can put on them. The commanders all do great things for them, ethereals with a 5+ feel no pain. Most stratagems are going to be really quite efficient on them, and they do get that very nice jump shoot jump one, moving out of terrain and then moving back afterwards. They're fairly fast at 10 inches and they have a stratagem to auto-advance 6 more. They get to deep strike if you need to. Coming in on turn 2 within Montcar range does give you a pretty guaranteed extra buff to your firepower. And I think in general most T'au lists are going to use at least some of these. There already appear to be a fair few decent lists that have done very well taking multiple big units. Quite nice that quite a lot of different loadouts do seem viable. You can really spec them for murdering light infantry with things like flamers, or go a lot more general purpose with things like cyclic iron blasters, plasma rifles and burst cannons. Having a small flotilla of drones also helps the unit's toughness as well. Those shield drones can be great for tanking high damage shots on, and at least a few of them are usually worth an include. Finally, the Crisis bodyguards do pay an extra 5 points for the bodyguard rule. I think that some of the time that is going to be worth it, some of the time it isn't. Probably not the best if you're using a big squad of 5 of them, that's going to get quite pricey. But on smaller units it does add a bit more insurance to stopping certain characters getting shot. Overall though, a seriously good unit, I'd expect to see a lot of them. Next up we have generic ethereals and Ornvar. I feel they're both maybe a little bit more efficient than Ornshi, and they both have the option to cast 2 different invocations on a 2+, giving out a 5+ feel no pain to a unit of your choice, and gaining a command point with the other one. The standard ethereal can do it with a relic, and they can take a hover drone to keep up with things like crisis suits. Ornvar's main advantage perhaps is that he's just really quite tough to take out between those guards and his invul save. He does have a tiny bit of melee threat, and you don't have to spend a relic on him. Basically, if you're not playing Farsight Enclaves, I'd say an ethereal casting those 2 invocations is pretty much an auto-include. Next up we come to the Commanders and Commander Shadowsun, all of which Games Workshop has done really well to make incredibly interesting, and there's some really potent combos for them. They have kind of okay damage output just for themselves, often having 4 guns hitting on 2s isn't too bad, though they aren't generally going to be quite as efficient as crisis suits just for pure damage. They give out their reroll 1s to hit aura. That one's always helpful with cyclic ion blasters. The Crisis Commander allows you to ignore modifiers such as the Assault modifier, and also allows nearby crisis suits to fall back and shoot, always handy if you happen to get locked up. For Warlord traits, you have the option of a couple of different ones of buffing nearby crisis suit damage, or you can take that amazing precision of the Hunter one. That's the one that allows you to reroll all hits and wounds with all of its weapons, great on things like the Cold Star Commander's high output burst cannon or that DW02 burst cannon, but just generally on everything as well, and it also props up that melee build, the one where you take the Onager Gauntlet, the Thermoneutronic Projector, and then you get to reroll all hits and wounds in combat with those as well. Speaking of the Cold Star, he's also pretty good as well. Getting an auto 8-inch advance on crisis suits certainly gives them a better threat range. His own movement is really quite handy for getting line of sight of things, or getting the charge off if you are building melee, and that high output burst cannon is a really efficient gun. Finally, last but by no means least, Commander Shadowsun herself is really good too. Maybe not quite in the same way, but just allowing 4 rerolls to hit with 1 unit is really nice. Plus she has a couple of longer range fusion blasters, and her Warlord trait allows you to redeploy 1 unit at the start of the game, always quite handy with getting the jump on the enemy, or keeping 1 key unit safe. Overall, commanders are excellent. Again, I'd say that at least 1 is pretty much mandatory, if not more. Next up, we basically have the Automate incarnation of the T'au gun line. It does appear that broadsides have won the battle to be the gun line unit of the T'au. Massive stat line boosts, really quite a nice points cost, and also now being a core infantry unit really just do give them all sorts of advantages. Typically people are leaving the high yield missile pods on the shelf in favour of the heavy rail rifles, and even if they happen to be out of line of sight, being able to take a twin smart missile system for just 15 points each is really quite nice, and it means that they can comfortably sit around and chip away or just hoover up any enemy units in the midfield. Their direct fire has great damage output against vehicles. It can get much better with the buffs that you can get for them, things like rerolls from commanders, or the T'au Sept +1 to wound if you fire multiple units at the same thing. But chasing that down with 24 smart missile shots out of a 270 point unit to hit something that was thought it was safe in the midfield, I can see how that could be a bit demoralising for the opponent. They aren't even particularly immobile like they perhaps were in previous editions as well. Their move characteristic is kind of short, but if you are running Montcar then they can also happily advance and still shoot fine. Or they could use an advanced targeting system, and that could keep them wandering around normally without advancing. They're certainly decently tough as well, 8 wounds with a 2+ save and able to get light cover. In general they are just going to outshoot the vast majority of enemies that come up against them, and can even lay down firepower if you tap them in melee now, thanks to those new battlesuit rules. Just for their raw gunline firepower, I'd be very surprised if that many people choose to pass up a unit of these if they are trying to make a super optimised T'au list. Next up, for the infantry holding the battle line and hopefully securing some objectives, we have the Fire Warriors, backed up by a trusty Devilfish. In the troop slot it's either Strike Squads, Breachers or Kroot, and all of them are useful. I generally see Strike Squads as perhaps the best home objective choice, objective secured that you can put on an important objective in your deployment zone, lay down some pulse rifle fire down range, and if the enemy units do get too close, they can hopefully step up and hit them with a whole load of rapid fire. Still though, Kroot aren't too bad for the same role. They do get some better saves in cover, and they are a bit cheaper. I think there's good things between the two for that. Perhaps more exciting though, I think, are Breacher squads in Devilfish, mainly thanks to that absolutely excellent Devilfish move and disembark stratagem, allowing you to zoom a Breacher squad potentially up to something like 24 inches away from where it started, and even then with a little bit of stratagem support, it can still do massive damage to whatever was on there. In terms of getting to objectives quickly, it's really quite nice, and pretty powerful that you can have multiple Devilfish do it per turn, making 2 or even 3 with that loadout not really the worst decision. Vespid Stingwings seem to be the go-to action unit for the Codex, cheap and fast auxiliaries with native deep strike, can be relatively expendable for putting on objectives, and while doing so actually throwing out some really quite efficient strength 5 damage 2 firepower, or perhaps just dropping it in an isolated quarter of the battlefield, doing an action like retrieve Nachman data, and then using their good movement to get somewhere where they can either be a threat or do yet more objective things. A fair few top tournament lists do seem to be running at least one unit of these, just a bit of a shame that their models are getting a bit dated. Next up, and sticking with auxiliaries, let's talk Kroot. Kroot Carnivores I think are going to remain a really popular troops choice, only 60 points for a big unit of 10 of them. They may be quite fragile when they're out of cover, but for just 6-point models they do some seriously good damage, both with a rapid fire weapon and some OK AP-1 melee. If they do damage though, I think it's a bit of a bonus, bullying a bit of light infantry units. Really I think what you want to take them for are lots of Auspex bodies on the cheap, and a very nice pre-game move that allow you to screen out enemy threats. It means they should be able to get in position quickly to take those midfield objectives, stop you losing too many points in the early game while your guns can get to work. They're also not terrible for sitting around on a home objective either, 20 points cheaper than a strike team. I think Kroot Hounds are certainly worth a mention as well at the same time. They basically do very similar things to what Kroot do. They don't have the ranged attack, but they have a little bit more melee and are quite a lot faster. I think the best thing about the Hounds though is that they just cost just 24 points for a tiny unit of them. So with that kind of cheap price tag, a really cheap pre-game move, and decent movement to boot, they're pretty much the ideal screening unit. Perfect just to throw up in front of an enemy unit that wants to be moving forward and delay it for a turn. Maybe hunker down or contest objectives that the rest of your force can't reach, and they do have a little bit of melee power as well. They could still potentially bully some light infantry. Anything that toughness 3 with a fairly bad save seems like quite fair game. I generally think that you could take a fair few units of Kroot Hounds. Every time they delay something important, contest an objective, or bully a squad, they'll have justified that 24-point cost. Finally, for screening in utility units, we have the stealth suits, 75 points worth of forward deployment units. You could have these guys to screen and hold back other enemy forward deployment options, things like Orc Commandos or Space Marine Incursors, and just generally keep a fair bit of your army safe. When they're there, they can certainly do some objective and action related things. Their burst cannons will put out a little bit of anti-infantry damage, though nothing spectacular, though they can be a little bit harder to shift than your opponent might expect due to their stealth rules. They're certainly not a bad unit for redeploying with that exemplar of the Cow Yon rule if they do happen to be a bit too far forward and the opponent gets the first turn. And potentially their ace up their sleeve is their homing beacon rule, a 5-point upgrade that you can give the squad that allow one of your crisis suit units to deep strike turn 1 if you want to. Combined with that redeploy rule, it means that you could basically have a guaranteed alpha strike on a decent chunk of the opponent's army. Crisis suits coming in on the first turn with their monk car buff could be really quite scary. To finish up, we have a couple of the really big guns. First up, the Storm Surge, a unit that I've made an entire video about if you do want to search that up. Basically though, it boils down to enormous firepower on a really quite durable chassis. It's got the crazy damage 12 shot with that pulse blast cannon when you're up close, so that works really quite well with either the T'au Sept single reroll or Balkan's stratagem to ignore invuls. With toughness 8, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, it really does make a lot of the other super heavies feel bad, though it isn't really all good news for the Storm Surge. Being a Lord of War does limit it a bit. It means that you're guaranteed to be paying at least some CP if you want to field them, and it also does have issues with terrain, like not being able to hide behind obscuring quite as easily, and maybe being a bit more unwieldy with movement lanes. Still though, I don't really think that having one in a list is usually going to be a liability. It can certainly do some heavy lifting, and the rest of the army can play around it while the opponent tries to deal with it. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Commander Longstrike, who seems to be getting preferential treatment over his fellow Hammerhead companions in some of the army lists that are doing quite well in the early days of the Tau release. As he's just 15 points more than a regular Hammerhead, that upgrade to go from Ballistic Skill 4+ to Ballistic Skill 3+ is kind of worth it just by itself. It's quite nice that that's a lot more resilient to modifiers than quite a lot of the rest of the army, and he also gets a couple of other really nice benefits, +1 to wound against vehicles and monsters, so he should be wounding toughness 8 on 2s with that railgun, and a few other minor benefits such as that Hammerhead command thing, and I believe that at least until they FAQ it away, he can still be protected by Crisis Bodyguards at the moment, as he does have the character keyword. I'm sure that's not intentional though, and I strongly suspect that that will get fixed. Even so though, even though he is a tank with a relatively fragile chassis for the big points cost, he does seem to be the most reliable way of putting that really big one-shot railgun into a list. The ability to end a lot of vehicles' lives in a single shot is pretty crazy, and Longstrike's a lot less prone to failure for that with his better ballistic skill and his +1 to wound thing. So with that said, that just about brings us to the end of our review of the T'au units and an overall tier list for the greater good in 9th edition. As always with these tier lists, I do look forward to hearing your feedback. Are there any units that you think that have underrated or overrated here? I'm always happy to hear other ideas. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. I'm sure there'll be a fair bit more for the T'au in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.